Good day and welcome to the Strong Ambition Podcast. I'm your host, Rylan Qualley. As always, we're going to dive into mindset today around training and nutrition with Laura Ceccarelli. Laura Ceccarelli has her master's in psychology, and she is currently a PhD candidate in clinical psychology. And this is her second appearance on the podcast. The last time she came on, we talked a ton about different things around sports and exercise and psychology. And now this one is a bit more of a unique episode because it was a Q&A and the questions came from my clients. It started off as just going to be a group call with Laura and my clients, and it just turned into a great conversation. And I thought I have to share this with my listeners. So this is a wonderful episode. And just to give you a little teaser here, we talk about food cravings. We talk about improving discipline and consistency, how to manage social environments, strategies to push a workout, and so much more. So this has some really tangible things that you can take from it yourself, because these questions are people just like you trying to improve themselves. So without further ado, we're going to dive into this. Great little interview here. I will caution you, I apologize that my microphone was not actively working as it should have been. So if I go in and out a little bit lower quality than I normally do, so I apologize for that. But for the most part, Laura has great information, so I'm certain you're going to enjoy this episode. So without further ado, here is Laura Ceccarelli.
Hey, Laura.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. We did have those questions that were already sent ahead of time. So the questions I sent there, did you have any particular order you want to go through them? You want me to kind of ask one at a time? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I don't mind the idea of kind of asking, question by question. I don't have a particular order that I prefer, but
okay.
Just kind of fire them off and we can chat in that way. That sounds good.
Okay, well, so one of the ones I'll bring up again here, the first things that were coming off was like, a lot of people come from nutrition, right? So when it comes to nutrition, we're trying to improve behaviors. And the very simple question is, what's going on with food cravings? And so what would be your best explanation from, honestly, clinical psychologist perspective? Like, how do people understand or grasp that and improve it?
Yeah, I think like the first thing I would say about that is, if you have a craving for anything, whether it's food or, like a craving for like substances or, like a craving for really anything, for happiness, like cravings and urges, I think are really human responses. Like if you're having a craving for food, it's because you're a human being, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with you if you're having a craving. That's like, a part of being human is that, we as human beings like things that feel good. And we also like things that, kind of take us away from feeling not good, or feeling bad or sad or lonely or frustrated or whatever those things might be. So I think, one of the things I would say for sure to start is at least trying to have a little bit of that kind of understanding and compassion for yourself when cravings show up, because the cravings in and of themselves aren't necessarily something that, is bad or a sign that, you're not doing things well. It's often, I think, how we respond to our cravings and respond to ourselves when we have those cravings. So I would just say, like, first, kind of just be able to recognize, that urges and, desires to feel good and do things that feel good and especially things that feel good, like in the moment, are a part of being human. It's a really human response. So there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing bad about that in and of itself. So try to take a bit of that, like, kind of judgment, frustration about it. I will also say too, like, cravings don't necessarily go away. I would say the more, though, we learn to kind of respond to those cravings in a way that, we want to, and in a way that kind of gets us the life that we want, they maybe become less bothersome, or they feel less intense. And we feel more confident in our ability to kind of resist them or choose something else, if that's what, we really want to do. So I think those would be like, a couple of things that I would say right off the hop is just sort of notice, like, how are you reacting when you have a craving? Are you getting super frustrated? Are you getting really, like hard on yourself? Are you feeling like if I don't act on this right now, I won't be able to handle it, or something like that? Just really trying to be aware of when those cravings show up. I would also say too, like trying to take a little bit of a curious, kind of approach to your cravings. Like even just trying to treat it like a little bit of an experiment, like over the week, kind of asking yourself, like when are these things showing up for me? Are there times when, are there other things going on in my life? Am I super sleep deprived? Am I feeling stressed about an exam or other things that are going on at work? Or in a relationship? And is this potentially, something that would feel good for me right now? Because some of those other things like feel tough or maybe like straining me a little bit. So just trying to be a little bit curious, I think, too, about like, what your cravings might kind of represent for you, and if there are times when you feel like you're a little bit more vulnerable, to those things and turning maybe to things that ultimately aren't getting you where you want to be.
Really love how you turned it to the perception of, what else is there. And, the gal that had reached out to you there, Alicia Castaneda, she really works with people on this idea of emotional eating. And her best advice she had, one of the best things that she had mentioned was just like, stay in it, like stay in the emotion. And, it took a couple times of talking with her for me to appreciate what that meant to stay in the emotion. But when you actually try it, the first time recently I practiced it and it was really potent. It was interesting. So I just felt stressed. I was overtired, so I didn't get good sleep. So it was restless sleep. Just some stresses going on with work and finance. I'm like just overthinking. So all these things make you in a bad mood, right? Bad sleep, stress, just like, so my knee-jerk craving, interestingly enough, wasn't so much inherently just food. It wasn't really as much food as it was smoking weed. That's a craving for substance all the same.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of the day, when it came to the opportunity to do it, I took that exact advice and I literally just sat by my computer closed and everything, just sat with emotion and just felt it, just felt my body, felt what I was feeling. And it was really remarkable, the transition that I made in that moment. And so I can't urge how what you had said is so helpful enough. If we're afraid to confront what we're feeling and mask it with food, you're never going to solve a problem. So
Yeah.
that simple idea of when you feel a feeling and then it's making you crave, or maybe it's triggering a crave, give it a few seconds before. Would that be fair kind of practice for people to look into?
Yeah, I think so for sure. Like, I think, what a lot of things with urges or cravings, or at least acting on those things, kind of come down to is that, it's a way of kind of turning, towards something that feels good and turning away from something that doesn't. And I think when, like, just like you said, when we can actually kind of turn towards our cravings and do that in kind of a balanced, kind of mindful or kind of aware way, where we can actually kind of, just turn toward that craving for just a craving, and saying, what, I'm feeling this urge to do this right now. And then trying to have, a little bit of kind of compassion for that craving. Like, I wonder, like, is something going on for me right now that, I'm feeling like I really need this? Like, why this feels like really urgent for me, or this feels like, it would be really comforting for me right now. And then I think also kind of asking, like, ourselves, like, in the big picture, what do I really want? I think some days you're going to make the choice that, what, like, yeah, I'm going to eat this food that's not on the meal plan right now because that's just what I really want. Like, maybe you're out with friends and you want to enjoy a good time. Or just in that moment, like, that piece of chocolate feels really good. And some days, I think thinking about that bigger picture and the things that you really want and matter to you in your life, you're probably going to say, like, what, this is a tough moment right now. And I know I'm looking to this for maybe a little bit of an escape or a little bit of comfort. And I think, like, in the long run, this is maybe not going to get me what I want. Like maybe I can just kind of sit with this for a minute, or like get myself a glass of water, or go do something else that kind of brings that same comfort, like having a bath, going to bed early, doing something else that you like, that kind of supports your overall goals related to health. So I would, also kind of like you just said, Rylan, like I totally adopt that practice. And even just that practice of delaying a little bit, I think people, what they learn from that is like, oh, I didn't do anything. And that craving or that urge kind of naturally like came and it kind of went, like it didn't just stay there and kind of consume my mind and not go anywhere. So I think you learn to be a little bit more confident in being able to manage that. The other thing I'll say really quickly too is like, again, knowing that cravings are like a part of being human. I think cravings are a part of like any lifestyle change too, because doing new things are challenging and they're not familiar and they take more effort and they take more energy. Have a plan for when, cravings do show up, rather than kind of hoping that they won't. They will. It's more like if, or when rather than if. So try to think about that a little bit in advance. Like, what do I want to do when that thing shows up? What do I want to tell myself? What, is something that I can do that would still kind of, feel good or kind of get me where I want to be, that still supports my goals.
Yeah, I really appreciate this idea of kind of both ends of the spectrum you're offering. Start with a little compassion and ask yourself it's okay, you're not a bad person. And really starting from that lens is super valuable, because you want to have both the critique and the discipline, right? And that was really where I was going to ask, is like, that's the magic dance we're always trying to do of self-improvement, is both compassion and critique. You need critique in order to seek out self-improvement, and you need compassion in order to heal from whatever you're stressing yourself with. And a couple of those tips were really valuable. I hope people take that, is the perception of waiting, start to pay attention to it. I think just overall, people need to pay attention to the food habits. And then if you have these cravings come up at certain times, a lot of people really encourage food journals for this reason. Like, have just a piece of paper, then you're writing down what you feel about your food, like how you're experiencing it, the emotions you feel when you're doing it. And you're going to learn a lot about yourself in that process. But anytime that you go into, eating food, and you decide to be mindful of eating that food, just that simple, pay attention to it, right? I'm, instead of just wolfing it down because, it's lunch or something like that, or, watching TV and just automatically forking it in, or, hey, I'm stressed, stomach feels something, you go, and it's really stress, it's triggering you. But just taking that moment to be like, wait, is it? Is it? And then, so that's where we can learn from the behaviors. But, you alluded to these ideas of discipline. So this is a really interesting mindset, that framework I'm trying to, kind of navigate for people and myself, is how do we really understand the appropriate discipline response? And my simplest, advice for most people is what you see is mildly uncomfortable. And, I've heard of this research where they have people do 4% harder. If you're doing 4% harder than what you're inherently used to, it's a sustainable long-term ability to challenge, depending on the task. But just this perception of, I tell people it's the minimum effective dose. Okay, so what is this one major thing? And it could be food or exercise, but like, it's a little bit harder than what you're used to. But you just know you can own that and promise yourself you're going to do that. And then honestly, don't promise yourself the all. Don't go all the way in. That's my approach for, modest discipline in over time, increasing that. Is there any other kind of direction you would kind of advise to improve discipline?
Yeah. And I think when you say discipline, like, what I think that really comes down to, is consistency. And I think that's ultimately what people want, is to be more consistent in some of the changes that they're making. And, I think there is a way to, be more consistent with learning a new behavior, making changes in your life in a way that isn't coming from that like really harsh, like critical, judgmental way. And I really like what you said there, Rylan, about just really trying to encourage your clients and folks to just take kind of like the smaller incremental steps. And that is an approach that I am a really huge fan of. I think, we sort of forget that, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And we can really underestimate how much those small changes can add up. And I think there's a few really good reasons for that. Like oftentimes if we, set, a more kind of like attainable, realistic goal, when we feel more confident in actually being able to do it. Like I know for me, when some days when I'm out running and I'm having a really hard time, I just tell myself like, you know what, just go to that next lamppost and then like reevaluate then. And then usually I'm like, okay, like next lamppost. And, and that, approach of like, just break it down a little bit, generally, I think works better. And it tends to be less draining for people than the like, you know what? No, like I'm going like hardcore, like pushing 110% for all my workouts this week, 7 days a week, when they haven't worked out, for an entire week, or they were sick, or, they missed a day or whatever. And what happens often then is people kind of, they don't really pace themselves, and then they're super burnt out, and then they actually kind of set themselves back, and then they feel guilty about that and less confident in their ability to, kind of move forward, like, oh, I failed again, at that thing. When really it's not that you failed at all. It's just that, kind of the initial approach was maybe not the most sustainable or not the most realistic. This is something we see a lot too with like, people with chronic pain, is that they have a day where they're feeling really good. So they like do, a million things on their to-do list. And then they're like down for the count for like a week because they've totally burnt themselves out. And I think we can often take that approach with like a lot of different aspects of our health, where we get really excited about something, and then we kind of go super gung ho, and then we're like, wow, this is like not sustainable. And now I'm burnt out, and now I'm feeling guilty for, not having achieved that thing that I said I would do. And I'm stupid and have no discipline because I wasn't able to stick with it. And it can be this really vicious cycle. So I think like that's usually, often when we're working with, any clients, is like, what is like the smallest incremental change that you could make today that would be a step towards, what you really want or what's really important to you, and try to do that more often.
Yeah, the step towards it, like the increment, and an increment that you you wouldn't come back on. And I think it's just like, the reason you talked about this capacity, people have a bit more of I almost want to say a naive belief of their capacity when it has to do with, discipline and will. But when it comes to the musculoskeletal system, everyone's very aware, oh, I can't do push-ups, I can't do chin-ups. We're super aware of our capacity musculoskeletal. Willpower and lifestyle behavior is exactly that. Like it's completely different capacity. And, you got to see your behavior change, even though you want that all cannot be your first step. That is a leap, that is a jump that literally your body couldn't even physically do. But if you look at it as like a step that you won't step back from, that's a better approach. And that's why I always tell people the MED, the minimum effective dose model, is so it's like take a step that is a conscious thought that might be a little bit awkward. So you're making progress because you don't want to be so insignificant that you're not making progress, but one that you'll just never let go of. In your mind, you're like, yeah, I guarantee you I can own this. And it's a little uncomfortable. And I feel like that is where people need to start having their internal discussions with themselves more. And like one thing in a category is more than enough. People will be like, okay, well, how many times you hear this in the new year, the amount of things that I heard people throwing out there. I'm going to read a book. I'm going to learn a language. I'm going to do yoga. I'm going to do so much exercise. I'm going to do nutrition. I'm just like, you're not going to do any of them. Choose one. And the thing I always tell people is I actually always choose a mindset word. That's it. Like, I'm not even trying to change all my behaviors at once. And I give people like kind of categories, if you have one thing for training that you're just really going to own, and then you have one thing for food that you're really going to own, that's more than enough, because that's going to take up a huge part of your mindset in life.
Yeah.
I really love this one-step approach, and, kind of just steering into the conversation somewhat about discipline to a degree, and things that can basically push you away from your discipline. So environments, and the one question was like social settings and dieting, and this is a huge thing, right? And
Yeah.
so I mean, I would love to hear your viewpoint on this, and how people could really understand to hold their towards their goals in the right angle.
Yeah, great question. And I think these things are so hard. And like, to be honest, like, it was funny because I was researching a little bit, leading into this talk, and I remember finding this one handout from one psychologist from who is a big kind of pioneer in a therapeutic approach called acceptance and commitment therapy. And he has this handout that I'll share with you after, Rylan, and you can feel free to distribute it to your clients. It's like publicly available, but just talks about, the I think it was like 7 steps to making change. And, it's things that people are not necessarily always like, it's not always new, but it's just like, those kind of fundamental or basic things, like when it comes to making changes, are really, important, and they really do work across a number of different ways. It's just kind of sticking with them sometimes is hard. Or they maybe don't get us the results as quickly as we'd like them to, and then we get frustrated. So I think like one of the things I really come back to is, I guess, a couple things. First is like really having a good understanding of like why you're choosing, to make changes in those departments. And it's interesting because some of the research related to physical activity has shown that people who actually choose to engage in physical activity for like the social aspect, because the social element is important to them, and that like, relationships is something they value, actually were more consistent with their exercise and engaged in more physical activity than people who were, kind of doing physical activity or exercise for their health. And we all hear that and we're like, oh my God, like obviously my health should be the most important thing. That should be motivation enough. But like for most people, it's not. Like, it's certainly a part of it. But for most of us, like as human beings, we're made to be close to other people, so those social elements or those relationship values, like those are things that tend to, often really drive us, along with other things. Like there might be kind of more personal values that we hold that might be connected to some of the choices that we want to make around food or exercise. So I would say like really taking a few minutes, at some point in your journey, and just kind of reflecting like, what is most important to me in my life, and how does making changes in this department, whatever it is, whether it's food or exercise, impact those values or impact those things that are most important to me. One of the interventions that I was a part of from the University of Manitoba, out of the Faculty of Kinesiology, we had people do this, and it was really interesting to hear, people's responses. Like they said, like, I never really thought about how being more active or eating healthier really helps me like be a better partner, helps me be a better grandparent, or even like, some people would say like, the importance of, I don't know, feeling kind of capable was something that's really important to them. And so that was, a way to kind of work on, that value, or that was sort of a way to move towards that value. And that actually, made it feel like they were more willing to do those behaviors or do those things, make those hard choices sometimes, because it was about more than just, being healthy, which is kind of this like, very vague and hard thing to really quantify. So I would say like really try to think about why you're making those changes. Then the other thing that I come back to all the time is like planning. And I don't mean over planning, but the research shows us, like whether it's in sport or other, domains, that if we actually think about what we want to do in a certain situation. So for athletes, a lot of times this is like thinking about what they're going to do if something goes wrong in a competition. Like for swimmers, if their goggles fall off, or like other sports teams, like if we get down a goal in the first minute, thinking about like, what actually we want to do or we can do in those situations, the more that people do that, the more likely they are to be able to respond differently in those situations. So if we say like, we know that a really tough situation is, being out with friends, and then so-and-so friend is like, oh, okay, like, are we drinking tonight, or passes the chips or whatever. And we immediately kind of shut down and give into that or whatever. And that's not, what we really want to do in that situation. Actually kind of thinking like, what could I do? Or how could I prepare for this a little bit better? If it's going out to eat, like, would it be helpful to kind of like have, a good kind of like, meal plan, consistent meal beforehand, so that you're not like starving when you get there? Or what could you say, when someone offers you that, that is respectful but still communicates like what you want. I'm going to say one more thing, just so I like don't forget this thought, but we can come back to it. But this is just related to, folks with chronic pain, again, like really struggle with this because they find that they need a lot of accommodation or support when they're, they can't always like, go for the walks with the friends, or they sometimes need to leave early because they're having a bad pain day. And so what happens is they feel guilty about that. So then they just stop going to these things. And then people stop inviting them because they think that they don't want to go. But really they're feeling badly about needing to kind of ask for what they need. And what often is really helpful for people is just to ask, like, really directly from people, or tell people, really directly, like, what, I'm working on making some changes with my lifestyle, and like, would you mind just like not offering me that? Because what, like having that around, it's just tough for me. And I know it's like, not everybody's like kind of in that mindset right now, but for me, that's just kind of like what I want. Or ask your friend, like, would you mind if we just like, had bubblies tonight instead of like, having a bunch of drinks? Or would you mind if I don't drink? And I know that's like, pretty simple, but honestly, like just asking people directly is something that generally works pretty well, because people want to help us and they want us to be well, but they sometimes just don't know what to do. And so that, being kind of clear can be really helpful. So I'm going to take a breath now.
Can't agree more. I can't agree more. That was within my initial NEM series. One of the very first things I told people: set up your environment physically and definitely emotionally and culturally. Talk to your family and loved ones. If you got a wife or a husband, it's like, tell them that you're going to eat different. You got kids, you got family, and friends do want to support. If you don't actually consciously tell them, hey, this is important to me, you're probably going to get more razzed than you are actually going to get support. But if you say, hey, actually, guys, I'm going to try to not drink this month, or I'm going to have maybe a drink, and it would really help me if you supported me. What friend wouldn't, want to support that goal because they admire that? And I really think that that's a super valuable lesson. And just coming back to what she had said too, is like, how do you want to handle it? And let's even come back from our original thing. Do a micro form of handling it, right? You don't have to say, go from one end, be like, okay, I'm going to go out with my friends and I'm going to drink nothing but water and I'm going to be a complete breakboard, right? It's like, no. How about instead of having many drinks, you have a few? How about instead of having the burger, fries, and dessert, you start with a burger and a salad? Like, you've got to still look at this habit formation, even especially in those things, as becoming something. And again, what is important for you to become? I really value that, because I went to that when it was like family gatherings, and I thought, okay, well, I'll just have a big salad and eat whatever meat's on it, and that's my thing whenever I go to Thanksgiving dinner. Well, now I'm missing out on all the potluck, right? We got like you've been to our dinners, like we got so many food, so many types of potatoes, lefse, dessert. Why not just have a bit of everything? And you start to enjoy, and again, come back to, well, what's the value? Well, I value that time with my family. And so all those are super, super important. And I think I'm probably going to keep always telling people, start with these micro things. And I also want to highlight what you said. You got to forgive yourself in the process in order to move forward from it. So I think all that's,
Yeah.
I think that's really valuable piece. I want to go into some of these other questions I got, and I'm also going to encourage anyone here to drop in any questions in the chat. So one question I got was pertaining to exercise. Roughly about 2/3 through a workout, let's call it quit, rather than go home. What's that? How do you get in that mindset to get in those last 2 or 3 exercise? What are strategies to kind of build in to get yourself that extra push in a workout?
Sure. Yeah. Again, first it's just kind of having that understanding that like there's nothing wrong with you when you have that response, because I would say literally every person with a pulse, has those feelings when we're doing something that's challenging, even if it's something that we like that is challenging. Our minds are just so good at like wanting to get out of stuff that doesn't always feel good. So I think first just kind of recognizing that for what it is. Like, you know what, this is just a thought that I'm having or an urge that I'm having, and it doesn't mean anything about me. Like it's kind of like more like when, not if those things happen. So again, just kind of knowing that those things are going to happen to some degree to everybody, as long as we're all living, and having some kind of understanding, for that, rather than kind of beating ourselves up. And I think again, one of the things that I know I come back to a lot, but I think oftentimes when we're making changes with our behavior or trying to do things that are new, or something that maybe we don't do consistently, like it's really easy, I think, for a lot of us to rely on like criticism and kind of really kind of like bringing that kind of harsh tone to getting ourselves to do like what we want to do. And the reason for that is because it works. Like anyone will tell you this. Like if you have, a boss who is like super mean and like hardcore, you're like, oh shit, like I need to get my shit together. The cost of that is that over time, that kind of creates or kind of, energizes us from this place of like fear. And, in the moment, or in the short term, that can be really motivating or really energizing, like really activating, right? It gets us to do things. But in the long term, what that can sometimes do is kind of trigger this other response that's part of our fear response that we don't often hear about. It's kind of a newer, it's a newer understanding of our fear response, which is our freeze response. And what that does is we kind of shut down. We're not actually motivated, or we feel more discouraged or more depleted and less like we have kind of less in the tank to do these things that we want to do. And so again, like I would really say like just trying to have a little bit of, kind of compassion for yourself. And I don't mean that in like, it's being compassionate with yourself doesn't mean like turning to being like, super, super, what's the word? I think people, yeah, complacent, or like even it's not coddling, it's not being like, oh, you know what? It's okay. Like, just go eat that chocolate bar. Who cares? It's not going to that, other end of the extreme, but it's being able to kind of look at your situation honestly and motivate yourself from a place that cares about you. I would say think about people in your life who do that for you. There are probably coaches, friends, maybe other people in your life who, who are those people who like, you know what, like, I get the sense that they care about me, and like they're super motivating, but like without being an asshole about it. And it just like makes me want to do stuff for them. Like they don't even ask me, but I'm like, I want to like show up and do a good job today. And that's kind of like what we want to be able to create in ourselves as best as we can. And I think those opportunities, like, I'm just at the end of my workout and, I'm just not feeling it or whatever. Like that's when you can kind of think to yourself, like, what would that person say to me right now? Like they wouldn't be like, you're a piece of garbage, like for feeling that way. Like, why don't you just like, get out of here and call it a day? Like, this is pointless anyway. They would be like, you know what? I can tell you're having a hard time right now. But you can do one more. Let's try one more. And then they'd be like, you know what? That was good. Like, let's try another one, and so it's not that they would be like, super demotivating, even like overly comforting, is that they would want you to do something from a place of like caring about you and believing that you can do it. So I would say like, just kind of try to be aware of that and see if you can kind of experiment with that a little bit, like, again, that kind of piece about like, just do one and then we'll see, let's try another one. And then let's reevaluate, like take kind of the pressure off needing to do everything.
Absolutely. We're coming back to the, one more lamp post, one more, like, can you push a little bit and really question yourself, because, I wanted to mention that before, because I'm not a long distance runner, as you know, Kaylin is, but when I was prepping for my last half, having to convince myself, okay, I got 10 miles. Well, you really don't want to say that word in your head. You say mile 1. Okay, let's see how we feel. And then mile 2. And then all of a sudden you're saying that to yourself at the end of mile 7. You're like, man, I don't feel much different. Okay, we got 10 miles in us today. And that's really like that mental endurance is what it's like in life. It's going to be a repeat effort. So this idea of taking it one step at a time is super valuable. But I want to come back to your narrative there. This internal story with yourself is super valuable. It kind of alludes to Stoic philosophy to a degree, is trying to be as objective as we can in being subjective beings, right? Like trying to, as much as you can, acknowledge your emotions and mistakes, but trying to be the best neutral thinker in that, whatever happens, I've had a few binges this year from smoking weed and binging, and I was like, okay, well, what did I learn from that? And I'll honestly say, when I started, like from years of binging, when I started to ask myself to forgive that action is when I started listening to myself for the cause of the action, because otherwise it's just a memory of hatred. Otherwise, it's just this shudder. I don't even remember. I put it out of mind, and I'm never going to do that again. And that's not how you learn. You don't just blank that memory. You have to know what led up to it. And then when I started to forgive, okay, what happened? And every single time it got better, and every time I learned from it. But let's kind of go into this self-compassion, because I think it's super valuable, and I know you can speak a lot to it. You keep alluding to it. So let's, on a fundamental basis, because we're going for this difference between the trying to find the in-between of a positive critic and self-compassion. And so what are some practices that you really encourage? Outside of what you've already mentioned, would you encourage some meditation, journaling, anything like that can help people better understand themselves, especially in these emotional times when you're trying to change behavior, but not tie too much negative emotion to an unsuccessful attempt so that you can keep moving forward?
Yeah, I think and I'll explain a bit about self-compassion, but I think one of the kind of biggest goals that we can, work towards as human beings is not like always hitting the workouts, always eating clean. Like it's not arriving, at a particular goal all the time. It's not black and white, right? I think the biggest thing that we can work towards as human beings, or one of the most kind of effective things we can work towards as human beings, is being flexible. So being able to, make, choices based on what we need and what's most important to us in a moment, in, any given moment. And what that does is that gives us a lot more options. We're not just always like leaving the gym when we start to, have some doubts or feel some discomfort or, get frustrated with things. We learn that, like, oh, I can actually stay in this, or maybe today I am super burnt out and drained and I do just need to go home. And that's okay. So I think like, what this is really all in the service of is that ability to be flexible and to make more kind of mindful or more, tuned in choices rather than just kind of defaulting to, checking out when we start to feel frustrated or when we start to feel, anxious or down or whatever that might look like. Because again, like this is a marathon, not a sprint. Like, hopefully we all have a lot of really long lives, and that's going to mean like millions upon millions or billions of choices about our health that we're going to make every day. And absolutely no one can make, 100% quote unquote good choices. And, that might actually not be the best thing either. What we really know about people is that the most healthy people, whether that's from like a physiological standpoint, from, a psychological standpoint, are the people who have kind of that like, middle ground, where they have like kind of a moderate amount of stress, or, they eat kind of like, a fairly consistent, diet, but they have some range, and so I think that that's what this is really about. And why I think self-compassion can be so important for that is because one, inevitably we're all going to experience failure. We're all going to experience disappointment. We're all going to experience difficult, times in our life and difficult emotions. And that's just a part of being human. And kind of like what I was saying before, like when we respond to ourselves with compassion, like that's really promoting like the long game. And the reason for that is because we actually activate systems in our body that, promote more recovery, that actually like promote more, motivation, and all those sorts of things when we're compassionate with ourselves. What the research has shown is that people who have more self-compassion generally actually show like greater improvement motivation. They show greater initiative in making changes when they have had a setback. And they just generally have kind of more positive affect and less negative affect, or like kind of less of those negative emotions, kind of overall. So I think that's, something like to think about, right? Is just that, is this maybe in the long run something that is going to make me a little bit more flexible and be a little bit more sustainable than just kind of always relying on like beating ourselves up for being super harsh on ourselves. And so, if I can sway anybody, that's what I would say. But in terms of kind of how to work on being, a bit more compassionate with yourself, I think first it's understanding what that means. I think, again, a lot of times people have these ideas that being compassionate with ourselves is like being soft, or just being complacent, or just like being nice to ourselves every time we're feeling some discomfort and like just, eating the entire bag of chips just because we're having a hard day. And I think that's really a misunderstanding of what being compassionate is. And the best way that I can, kind of describe it is, again, when you think about that, like really great coach, maybe it's that really great trainer, or that really great person in your life who, genuinely cares about you. And that's what that kindness piece is about. Like they have a genuine care and concern for your well-being and you doing well and being well. So they're able to say like, what do you really need right now? And that's, I think, a really important question to just be reflecting on, like, especially in those moments of, feeling frustrated or having urges, like what is really most important to me, or like, what do I really need right now? And oftentimes, like when we ask ourselves that question and we can do that really honestly, like from that place of like, I care about you and I want you to do like what is most important to you and what's going to keep you well. It does kind of, give us the answer of like, what, as easy as this might feel, or as comforting as this might feel right now, to like go to the chips or skip the workout and just, sit on my couch and watch Netflix all night. I know like later on, I'm going to regret this. Like, I'm going to wish that I went to the workout, or I'm going to feel bad about it. And this is something that I'm working on. So as hard as it is, like, I'm going to do it. So I think that's a big part of being self-compassionate, is kind of just reflecting on, like, what do I really need? And maybe thinking about who that person is in your life, and kind of having that in the back of your mind. Like, what would so-and-so say to me right now? What would they tell me? Maybe even having like a reminder of that on your phone, or writing it down somewhere. Again, like, when we're learning new things, we expect ourselves to just be able to think of these things in the moment. And when it's new, like, we don't, it's hard. So we need sometimes those visual reminders, or that practice. So try doing that a little bit in advance. Selfcompassion.org is a really great website with a lot of different kind of ideas for practicing this. But I would say, yeah, like, there are great meditation apps that you can do that kind of have a more compassion focus to it. But I would just start with that, like, kind of tuning in to what you're feeling when you're having a hard time. Like, just asking yourself, like, what's going on for me right now? Recognizing it as a moment of difficulty. A lot of times when we're having a hard time, we get into that really, like, kind of extreme feelings where we think, like, this is so awful, I won't be able to handle this. Or we just totally turn away from it. We're like, nope, this is not happening. Or like, nope, I don't want to do that thing because it's going to make me feel anxious, or it's going to make me feel, it might create conflict, or, whatever it is. So turn towards that in a balanced way. And then trying to think, like, from a place of, I care about you and these things are important to me. What is it that, I really need in this moment?
Really well stated. My favorite thing that you come back to there is this person, and create an identity for it. To me, it made me think about a boss, because I had many bosses in my life. Some bosses I loved, some bosses I didn't, and both in opposite ends. So one that was fear-based, where he would get on you for everything, and he did behave. I changed my behavior for him, because if I wasn't there at 7:30, he was going to be chewing me, like, every single time, like a minute late, even though we just sat around and do anything, he was going to get on me, and I just didn't want to deal with that. It was fear-based, but it worked. But I didn't like working with him, and I didn't want to stay there. Years later, I worked for AJ Zeglin, and he was inspiring. He was compassionate, but if I disappointed him, I knew I messed up and I had to do better. And so having that nice in between, and I think that would be another personality for people to think about. Think about the bosses in your life that actually were more of like a coworker that supported you towards what you were trying to work together on. And I mean, I remember I just changed AJ's tire just because I wanted to help him. That's the kind of person that you want steering a ship. And that's really who you are in the end, right? Is you got to see yourself, the inner best version of yourself, and communicate with them. So really valuable stuff. If anyone else has a question, and drop it in the chat. Outside of that, what I would really like is just, let's try to encompass what you talked about. Self-compassion is the bottom part that people have to start with. I think is just really one of the main themes that people should come from. And it is very valuable, because then you can be a more open arms with your errors. I want to come back to something you mentioned. And just in terms of behavior change, it's been a very eye-opening perception and kind of analogy for me. You wouldn't critique yourself if you're trying a new sport, right? Like, you would have like, oh, I'm not a good golfer, but I really want to golf. And so you would say, okay, well, it'll take a couple of years before you're good. Yeah, and I'm going to do it. But you wouldn't critique the hell out of yourself. You're going to feel emotion. You're going to hate it at times, but you're like, I'm on this mission. I'm going to do it. Well, give yourself, honestly, years of developing into a lifestyle no different than a skill like that. And you would want a coach that coaches you through that all the same. So having that minimum effective dose to develop the skill of lifestyle. And I think we had a lot of other good points, as far as, who do you want to be in social situations? When are things important and align with your values? Trying to be both pushing forward, but seeing the flexibility. Is there any other good tips that we haven't hit on? Because I think we hit on a lot that you would really encourage all my clients to really know about behavior change and trying to go towards their goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, like, I'm going to say this over and over again, but really try to start with, like, what can I do right now in this moment that brings me like an inch closer to what it is that I really want in my life. And and we can do that like many, many, many times a day. If we are only working towards like, I'm only gonna, like all that matters is like hitting that weight. Like that can be a long time away, and that can be really discouraging. It can be really demotivating. There's lots of things that happen along the way. So really try to think about like, what in this moment can I do that brings me an inch closer? And what that does is like, not only does it make you feel more confident and capable to be able to do that, but you're going to have more experiences of success. And again, like I said, coming back to that kind of like, basic human principle of like, we do more of what feels good and avoid what doesn't feel good. And the more we have success, the more we're going to be inclined, or kind of lean towards, those options. And we're going to feel more confident, and we're going to actually develop our skills in those areas too. So all really important things anytime we're learning new things is trying to, create as many success opportunities for us and for ourselves. And often what that means is doing less, in a moment, but knowing that those small changes really, really do add up. And I can't come back to this enough, like, as like, kind of boring as it is for people, like planning is just such a like fundamental skill that we kind of forget or think we shouldn't need to do when it comes to health behavior and especially making behavior change. And I just want to like, come back to this like over and over again, because it's such an underused skill, I think, for a lot of people. Like if you have no groceries in your fridge, like, of course you're going to order skip the dishes. Like any, person, living being would do that. Right. And so any way that you can kind of involve planning, thinking a little bit ahead, having the things that you need around you in order to make these changes, and knowing when you struggle to do that, and kind of thinking about like, what can I do in those moments, rather than just kind of hoping you don't do those things and then feeling super frustrated, when maybe you make a decision that you're not happy with. So planning, and really, again, like trying to, understand that nobody's going to be perfect at this. So trying to kind of have that understanding of like, I'm not the only one who struggles with this. This was a tough time. What can I take from this, or what can I do now, to move forward from it? You have to be able to, give yourself a little bit of a break. So like I said, being perfect, doesn't always lead to the most fulfilling life either, and actually can be like, detrimental. Like, if we go to that other end of the extreme, that's actually not the most healthy behavior. So really try to think about it as like, I just want to be able to be flexible, and I want to be able to, have a life that is fulfilling for me, not just achieve this one thing. Because for most humans, that's not going to do it. So just keep that in mind.
Terrific advice. You nailed it, Laura. This was an awesome Q&A, super valuable. I'm pretty sure I'm going to make this into a podcast because there's so much good tidbits in there. I love it. It's the planning too. Like that's huge. Like that's the first thing I tell people when they sign up. I'm like, I'm not saying you have to meal prep all the time, but you should plan what you're going to have. And that comes before actually preparing food. Exercise, luckily I take care of it, but did you put it in your calendar? And so like, if we don't make these, arrangements, and then you had even alluded to, well, what about planning for the social situation? What about planning on who you're becoming in these environments? And this is all a matter of setting. This is really like, I'm planning on being this person, not just, let's just see what happens. Because we know what happens when we see what happens, right? And so, the same thing. And so any case, this was wonderful. I've got no questions in the box here. So I think you nailed it all. I really appreciate it. I'm going to have you out here again, probably in a few months. But thank you so much, Laura, and thank you everyone else for joining today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again to Laura. That was an awesome conversation. And I just got to say, that's why I had to share it with you, because there was so much really helpful, tangible things that I think people can utilize and practice and need to hear, especially just off the bat with food cravings. Like, this was genuinely me talking to her about me understanding my own psychology around these things. And so many things that she discussed there are real practical tools that you should be able to implement yourself, but they're always going to come back to practicing it. And you hear her talk about compassion and having patience with it over a long period of time. It's just always the slow and steady and the boring answers where we get the best things that happen. So I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I think there's a lot for you to really learn from. I would even come back to listening to what she had talked about in the past, like re-listen to some of these things, write some of these notes down and start to put them into practice. But as I mentioned in the podcast, you don't need to put them all into practice at once. You practice one thing in one realm at a time, one thing in exercise, do one thing in nutrition. And just like Laura had mentioned, what is going on now in my present state that's actually going to help me move forward? Like, how am I actually looking at this now in the present state? And these are really helpful tips that I know I use. I know that my clients get good success with. So I highly recommend you put them to practice yourself and to be compassionate with yourself if it doesn't work. One of the other really good tips I got from Jordan Sayat, who was on an earlier podcast. If you haven't listened to that, listen to that episode. But it wasn't on his podcast. It was actually from his book. And he talked about, you just can't mess this up if that's your mindset, that I'm just never going to quit. And I thought that was such a beautiful sentiment. That's kind of the whole notion I've taken towards most things in my life when I'm trying to get better at them. And it's something I truly, truly want to get. It's like, I'm just not going to quit until I get it. And that's a beautiful sentiment to realize, like, it's not like you're going to attempt training is certain for a certain physique, or try diet just for a certain period of time and then I fail, and it's like, well, I fail forever. It's like, that's just doesn't even make sense, right? If this attempt doesn't work, then I quit forever. Like, that doesn't make sense. But if you say this attempt might not work, but I'm just never going to quit, that mindset is actually just the most logical one to have. And it's also kind of calming, because then you're willing to try more. Because then if things don't work out one week, then I have next week, I have tomorrow, I have the day after, and I got the rest of my life to try to get this right. And actually, it's the pursuit of trying to become better that's going to make you better, right? It's just literally the process of trial and error is who you want to be. We're not going to achieve a perfect life. We're trying to work towards we're trying to be people who are just trying to achieve things in life. And that's the perfect life. Right? So I know it's corny because it all goes towards the whole sentiment of this podcast and my program, but really think about that. Be a person that's just going after things. You're not trying to get to an end state. And if you have the mindset that you're never going to quit, you're just always going to keep doing it, then there's no such thing as failure. As corny as that sounds, it's a very true statement. It's also the most logical one to take, right? So just don't quit on yourself. Start to re-listen to these, practice these, and be patient with yourself. Be compassionate and just keep on, right? Because it is not about the pursuit of happiness, my friend. It's about the happiness within the pursuit. And I'll catch you next time.